Well, good evening, everyone. It's Pastor Jeff here from Trinity Baptist Church in Sherwood Park. Maybe you're a regular here from our church who's tuning in for our Tuesday night Bible studies. Maybe you've just found us on the internet. You're welcome to join. For about the next 25 minutes, we're going to do a Bible study as we've been doing for a lot of COVID. And hey, if you're an Oilers fan, I understand you might need a little diversion from your grief tonight. So let's get into the Word and encourage each other through what God has to say to us. On a more serious note, as we get into things, when you are doing your evening prayers tonight, especially if you're from our church, many of you will know one of our faithful people who attends even this video series, a man named Dan at our church. He's undergoing a pretty severe medical crisis right now that really needs a miracle in the next day or so. So if you want to pray for Dan and his health tonight, that would be great. All right, well, let's get into things here tonight. I want to start maybe by telling kind of a bit of a cheeky story of how I pranked my dad in my college years. I started dating this gal that's now become my wife, but I hid it from my dad for a little while. My parents, being the hospitable people that they were, they and still are, they wanted to have us invite some college friends over for Thanksgiving. You know, the kind of people who perhaps couldn't make it home to their house for Thanksgiving out of town. So anyway, told my dad, sure, I'll invite a friend over for Thanksgiving. And my dad thought that I presumably had invited some big strapping college guy full of life and vitality. But instead, I secretly invited my then girlfriend and new girlfriend at that. Didn't tell my dad who was coming. So the doorbell rings that day, and my dad swings open the door, expecting to see a big dude. And who does he see? He sees this wonderful little blonde gal, who, of course, now is my wife. It's kind of funny sometimes when you are expecting something and then you see something completely different, which actually ends up being much better. We're going to see that illustrated in a much more potent and amazing way in our chapter here tonight. If you're just joining us now, or maybe you've been with us again, I just want to remind us we're working through the New Testament book of Revelation, that big scary book. We're trying to make it more understandable and less intimidating to people. So as a reminder, we've already been through the prologue. We've already been through kind of the first window, as it were, in most of chapters 2 and 3, a little bit of chapter 1. But we're now in window chapter 2, which basically goes from chapter 4 through to most of chapter 11. And it's a great little, great section that we're going to get into here today. As a reminder to you, chapters 4 and 5, we're in chapter 5 tonight. These chapters together show us who is really in charge of human history. And that, of course, is Christ the King, who's on the throne. We're going to need this reminder here in these two chapters because as we get into chapters 6 through 11, it's going to show us the messiness of human history, which is really this clash of God's incoming kingdom and, of course, the kingdoms of this world and all the fireworks that happen as a result. So that's a little bit of background. As we saw in chapter 4 was all about John seeing the throne of God in heaven. Chapter 5, on the other hand, which we'll get into today, John saw something very surprising at the center of the throne. Again, in chapter 4, especially if you look at the hymns within chapter 4, we see that God is being praised there as the creator. And in chapter 5, as we look and we see the 3 hymns that are listed here, we see God being praised, actually we see the Lamb being praised, not as creator, but as redeemer. So we'll get into some of this, some of the surprise stuff that we see in the throne in just a minute. But I do want to remind you that we are in Revelation chapter 5 tonight. If you've already read this, wonderful. But if you haven't read chapter 5 yet, I would encourage you right now to pause the video and to read Revelation chapter 5 beginning to end. So go ahead and pause it right now. All right, if you didn't pause it or if you unpaused it, I'm going to assume we've all read Revelation 5, and so now we can get into it together with a little bit of kind of shared knowledge. So the first section that we're going to look at is verses 1 through 5, which is kind of its own little section within this chapter, and this really contains John's vision of a scroll. You can see it starts it in verse 1 by saying, "Then I saw." Well, that's what it says in the NIV translation of the Bible. It's probably better to insert the word that's there in the Greek, the word that we translate, behold. In other words, look, I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll. In the right hand obviously connotes power and authority. The word scroll there is obviously meaning some sort of a papyrus kind of scroll that's was popular back then, and there's writing on both sides of the scroll. That wasn't always usual. As you can imagine, you had to write on both sides if you ran out of room to write everything you needed to write down. I think of this almost think of like a postcard. Not many of us send postcards anymore, but postcards were like, there was no inside to them, but all the writing was on the outside. People could see it if they wanted. And here we have writing on the inside and even the outside of the scroll. But it's sealed with 7 seals. And of course, those seals, as you can imagine, were used to ensure that only a person who was truly worthy, with proper authority to open these scrolls, would open them and then see the message revealed therein. I think the big question for us when we think about this kind of writing is, what is on this scroll? Doesn't it make you curious? What is on this scroll? Well, some people think it's maybe even the book of life, as has been mentioned already in Revelation, will be mentioned at the end. No, probably not. More likely, this scroll contains the overall plan for human history, for salvation history. It's about how God's kingdom is going to come on earth as it is in heaven. This scroll contains the content, not just the content, but the meaning of history. In a word, it would contain the destiny of history. And it's a comforting thing to know, even without even knowing what's on it, to know that there is a plan. There is a scroll that contains history in God's eyes. God has a plan for history. It's not random. History is not an accident. It's not just meaningless tragedies when we encounter such things. God has a plan for his history. But we find right away in verses 3 and 4 that there is a problem. No one is found who is worthy to open the scroll or even to look inside it, as it says at the end of verse 3. No one in heaven, no one on earth, no one under the earth. Those 3 spirits are going to be repeated at the end of the chapter. No one can crack the code, so to speak. I mean, we as humans, we can do a lot. I was driving around town today, and I was actually just pleasantly reminded again of how beautiful a city can be. God's creation is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but what man has done with God's creation can be beautiful too, in the way that we construct our cities and our hospitals and all these intricate things that we can do, driving and flying, but we can do all this, but we can't crack the code to the meaning and the destiny of history. No one can. And at that thought and at that realization, the Apostle John started weeping. In fact, it was kind of like an ugly cry. That would be the description that he gives about himself in verse 4. And then in verse 5, an elder, one of these 24 elders, interjected and told him, "Do not weep." And then there's another, "Behold," like, "See." And then he points him to 2 things, 2 descriptions. The Lion of Judah, the Root of David, referring to the same person. The Lion of Judah is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. If you want some background on that, you've got to go back to the first book of the Bible, Genesis 49, where we see the 12 tribes of Israel being blessed by Jacob, and they're given different descriptions about themselves. The tribe of Judah is one that's talked about like a lion. Read all about it there, but there's a messianic promise that's hooked into there. And in fact, by the time you get to the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Lion of Judah was a quite common term to describe this Messiah that everyone was hoping for. But he's also referred to as the root of David. And again, got to look in your Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 11 is a place that you can go. There's another messianic term here. It's a term actually, and it's a passage from Isaiah 11 that we often read at Christmas, referring to this Messiah that we're waiting for. So this elder says, see, there's this Lion of Judah. There's this root of David, and he has triumphed. He's able to open the scrolls and its 7 seals. And so you can see that there's this like command there from this elder who wants to care for this ugly, crying, weeping John. He tells him to look. And then the scene is about to shift, and we go to the rest of the chapter. And there's this vision here that's quite surprising for John. In verse 5, again, he's told to see and look for this lion. He expects to see a lion, someone who's massively huge, powerful, ready to take on all the armies against God. Maybe a little bit like my dad, at that Thanksgiving, opening the door thinking he's going to see a big hulking college dude. But instead, my dad saw this wonderful lady. Here in Revelation chapter 5, verse 6, John, this is what happens to John when he looks. Then I saw a lamb. A lamb. He didn't see a lion, he saw a lamb. Now, the normal Greek word for lamb is amnos, which is not the word that is used here. Instead, John uses a very curious term here. In Greek, it's not amnos, which is the one for lamb. It's arneon, which is the word that we would translate as little lamb. This is a comparatively rare word in the New Testament. It's only used once elsewhere in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, actually, another book that he wrote. But it's used 29 times here in Revelation to describe Jesus. Arneon, little lamb. That's who he is, little lamb. And that is surprising. John expects to see a lion. Instead, he sees a lamb. I want to read to you from Leon Morris, one commentator on Revelation, and I just love his words here. When earthbound men want symbols of power, they conjure up mighty beasts and birds of prey. Russia elevates the bear, Britain the lion, France the tiger, the United States the bald eagle, all of them ravenous. It is only the kingdom of heaven that would dare to use as its symbol of might, not the lion for which John was looking, but the helpless lamb. And at that, a slain lamb. Oh, this is good. This is good. And we're going to see this so many more times in the book of Revelation. The lion actually wins by being a lamb. Let's get into this a little bit. Some of the details about this lamb are listed in verse 6. He's looking as if he's been slain. And we know where that comes from. That's coming from the cross. We know that looking like it's been a slain lamb is, of course, also referring to a sacrificial lamb. The whole Old Testament system of sacrificing lambs, culminates in Jesus as a sacrificial lamb on the cross. But where is this lamb? Well, John sees him standing at the center of the throne in heaven, in God's place, on God's throne. That is incredibly bold. And of course, we can see here that he's also encircled by the representatives, like the power representatives of all creation. We've got 4 living creatures there, and we've got these 24 elders. Again, I think symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. All of God's people represented by those and the 4 living creatures. These guys are surrounding or encircling this lamb who's at the very center of the throne. More is talked about this lamb. He has 7 horns and 7 eyes. Does Jesus really have 7 horns and 7 eyes in glory? No, no. Remember the symbols that we've already been talking about here in Revelation. 7 being a number that connotes completeness. Horns, a symbol of strength. And so for Jesus to be described as one with 7 horns is saying that he has complete strength. 7 eyes. Again, 7 complete eyes are a symbol of wisdom, complete wisdom. He has complete wisdom. Not a dumb, weak sheep. Here Jesus is being described as completely strong and wise. You get down to verse 7, and we get to see what the Lamb did. I'll read it for you. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. I find it so funny. It's so quick, so matter of fact. There's no debate. There's no introductions. There's no delay. He just took it because he was worthy. And he was worthy because he has the strength and the wisdom of God, complete strength and complete wisdom. And with him taking this scroll of the meaning of all human history, of the destiny of all of us and all of creation, by him just doing that, he set off a huge ripple effect of worship there in the heavenlies as John sees it. The first ripple is kind of like the most inner circle of the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, whom we've already met in chapter 4. As it says here, in verse 8, they fell down, they had harps in hand, they had prayers of God's people in hand. Maybe we'll come back to that in more detail later. And they sang a new song. That's what verse 9 says. Now, again, a little bit of a side tangent here. In the New Testament, a new song is always a sacred song. And also in Revelation, I mean, the word new is kind of a recurrent theme too. We're going to find later, there's a new name that we're given, new heaven, new earth. Chapter 21 says God will make all things new. But when he says new, it doesn't mean a new invention. It means fresh. And here we have this fresh song that is given. But before we get into the content of this song in particular, in this first kind of ripple, I think we got to ask, like, what else is going on here in this song? Like, we've seen 2 songs in chapter 4. We see 3 of them here in chapter 5. And there's going to be more to come in chapter 7 and onwards from there. Well, one of the things I think that John is doing here is he's actually being very bold and very prophetic in criticizing the culture of his time. So back in his time, and especially in Asia Minor, the worship of the emperor, or the imperial cult, as people would call it, was very popular. You could go on archaeological tours and you could find in many of the places in Asia Minor that this stuff was just going on a lot. And remember, this is where John was writing these letters to earlier in Revelation, a place that is steeped in imperial cult worship. Now, if you would do a little bit of research, you could find this on your own probably pretty easily. When you look at these imperial hymns that were written for the emperor, it would include certain phrases. Now, I want you to be looking at the hymns in Revelation 4 and Revelation 5 as I read these things. The hymns to the emperor included phrases like the following: Holy One, glory, salvation belongs to you, authority, worthy to receive power, righteous are your judgments, our Lord and God, Lord of the earth. These are all phrases or attributes given to the emperor. But as you're hearing those, don't you see those like sprinkled all throughout these hymns? That's really interesting. Yeah, the kingdoms of this world, especially in that context, but also in the sense ours, they like to beef themselves up, and people are all too happy to give them their allegiance and, in a sense, their worship or worship. But we know, because John's telling us, who's truly worthy of worship, and it is no earthly ruler. It is the true emperor, the true king over all of the earth, that being the Lamb. So let's look at the content first of this first song, verses 9 and 10. It says that you are worthy to take the scroll because you were slain. With your blood, you purchased people for God. People, not just people of Israel, but of the whole world. But again, the language that's being used here, purchasing back, it's the language of redemption. This is language of like freeing slaves. And we don't have to go very far in our minds to remember the story in Exodus of God freeing slaves, redeeming slaves from Egypt with lamb's blood put onto doorposts as part of that redemption. Remember that? And here we have, with blood, a purchasing of people for God. But not just one nation, but people from every tribe and language and people and nation, as it's said here. And, of course, he did that in order to make us into a kingdom and priests. Now, we've covered that already. Again, you can go back to chapter 1, verse 6. There's that little language there about a kingdom and priests. That's what we're called. And that's, again, coming out of Exodus chapter 19. And the promise here is that they will reign on the earth. So that's just ripple number 1 of worship. Ripple number 2 of this ever-widening reaction of all creation to the Lamb taking the scroll is all of the angels. Verse 11 says, and then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. That's a huge, huge number. And in verse 12, they say in a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive, and there's 4 things listed, or not 4, 7. 7 things listed. Of course there's going to be 7. I mean, John's working in 7s all the way through Revelation. To receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise. Wonderful things here. Now, if you want to be really kind of picky and something neat about this, you can compare that list with what is written in 1 Chronicles 29, verses 10 through 12, where at the onset of building Solomon's temple, these words were used to give praise to God. But obviously contrasting with the building of Solomon's temple, here we have this worship going on in this heavenly temple, this heavenly throne, giving praise to Jesus. So it's wonderful. So that's ripple number 1, ripple number 2, and lastly is ripple number 3. Every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, on the sea, and all of them. Let's just read it, verses 12 and 13. In a loud voice, where am I? Verse 13. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. Oh, so good. And then in verse 14, the 4 living creatures who began the worship thing back in chapter 4, now they bookend it by saying amen, and the elders fall down and they worship. Whew, okay. That's really fun. That's pretty beautiful. What does this mean? What does it mean for all of us? Oh, there's a lot more here that I could probably say. I'm looking at the time knowing we don't have much time. Maybe one thing to say. Well, I'll say 3. We are never alone in our suffering. The Lion of Judah actually is, in truth, the Lamb who was slain. He still bears the scars of his sacrifice. Doubting Thomas got to see that firsthand when he put his fingers in and did a visual inspection of the scars of Jesus. And it's a scarred Jesus who ascended to the right hand of the throne of God. He himself has and still bears the scars of his suffering, which John himself saw here in Revelation. We are never alone in our suffering. Whatever suffering we go through, we have a Lamb who is on the throne right now, who still bears the scars of his sacrifice for us. That's the kind of God whom we pray to in our own suffering. So we're never alone in our suffering. That's maybe a first point. Secondly, we were redeemed at a great price. Again, there's all that language of rescuing us from slavery, Egyptian slavery in the case of ancient Israel, spiritual slavery, and many other kinds of slavery for us. We were redeemed at a great price. One of my favorite authors, Darrell Johnson, he mentions that here, the Lamb goes to the cross because of us. The Lamb goes to the cross for us. The Lamb goes to the cross instead of us. Because of us, for us, and instead of us. I love that. And last point is that the lion overcame by being a lamb. And we can follow that way too. Jesus did not win by just flexing worldly power and destroying all of his enemies in the way that we would expect people to do with the shock and awe campaign. He won by being a slaughtered little lamb. That is an upside down kingdom. But this is what the New Testament teaches. I mean, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he mentions that Christ crucified is the power of God, right? The seven horns, right? The power of God, and the wisdom of God, the 7 eyes, as talked about here in Revelation. Paul calls Christ crucified the power of God, the wisdom of God, seemingly foolish and weak to human eyes, but in God's true vision, the real power and the real wisdom of God himself. That's how he won. True power is found in weakness. The lion overcame by being a lamb. And that is the way for us as Christians to follow as well, to be people, not doormats per se, that's not really what I'm saying, but not by using power in the way that the world uses power. Not proof for that? Look at how Jesus opens his mouth in the Sermon on the Mount. He starts with the Beatitudes. Who inherits the earth? The meek do. The meek do. And there's so many other things. You look at the Beatitudes, it's not the strong and the so-called powerful who win. It's the weak and the meek who do. Amen. So again, we're never alone in our suffering. We were redeemed at a great price, and the lion overcame by being a lamb, and we can follow that way too. All right. I know I'm over time a little bit here. We'll have to call it there for tonight. Again, if you have any comments, you can leave them on Facebook. If you haven't greeted each other yet, you can do so there too. You can ask any questions that you like there, or send me a private message as well. If you've got some things that you think I didn't maybe nail or cover quite as much as you'd like, I'll try and get to that as I can. As a reminder for you, I mentioned this briefly on Sunday. Next Tuesday, we'll continue along in our study, but we won't start at 7 o'clock, because at 7 o'clock we'll be having a church business meeting online instead. So we're actually going to start at 6 p.m. here, and we'll do our thing here, and then by 7 o'clock, if you're able to, you can join the church business meeting. And of course, if you want to get ahead, I think some of us do sometimes, you want to read Revelation chapter 6, you can go ahead and read that in preparation for next week, and then you can even sneak into the first little bit of chapter 8, the first 5 verses of chapter 8. All right, well, we'll call it there for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again pretty soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.